Hello there and welcome to this video, and today I have a very special guest with me. I've got a long-time associate of mine, Mr. Mark Hartley here on bass. Say hello, Mark.
Hi guys, how you doing?
So we are going to be discussing Mark's 5 favourite bass players, and he's going to be putting them in some sort of order. Obviously on the video I've said the 5 greatest bass players of all time. Of course, there's no such thing as there's the 5 greatest bass players of all time. So we're really dealing with Mark's favourite bass players. Mark's played with me for a number of years on lots of different projects. When I first met him, I was really impressed with the variety of techniques that this guy does on the bass, and I think it's going to be quite interesting to tease out from these guys what you got from them, you know. So, shall we kick off? So,
sure, yeah.
So at number 5, who have you got at number 5?
Right, so at number 5, and this is a really difficult choice, but I'd say Stuart Ham. Okay,
Yeah.
so the reason I've put Stuart Ham at number 5 is when I was growing up in the 1980s, when his first album came out, Radio Free Album, at the time it was pivotal because he was kind of that next generation after Stanley, Clarke and Jacko that had put things like tapping, slapping all together in one package, if you like.
Yeah.
So the very first album, which was fantastic because you'd also got Alan Holdsworth on there, Joe Satriani, you know, some amazing players, and it just really floored me at the time, and it really inspired me to go to the next step of taking all the techniques I've learned today and progressing them further. His approach to tapping was slightly different to what everything else that was going on at the time, i.e. it was more pianistic. On his album he
rather than sort of Billy Sheehan's voice,
yeah,
Eddie Van Halen type
Aronoff, because at the time, you know, to put it in perspective, it was around 1988, the Eddie Van Halen thing was still there, the guitar shredders were still there, and it was slightly different from that. And yeah, major influence on where I was at the time, and I still do things today that probably draw upon bits and pieces.
It's odd how I can remember that album coming out in the 80s, and it floored me as well because I bought it because Alan Holdsworth was on it and Satriani was on it, wasn't
Yeah,
it? So with those two on it, I bought it. But actually, for me at the time, of all, I mean, people say, oh, the first time you hear Jacko or the first, but for me, the first time I heard Stuart Ham, I thought it was astonishing. And yet, as time has gone on, that reputation hasn't seemed to carry on. He's not mentioned now in the same breath as a Jacko or Stanley Clarke.
No, I think over time he's kind of changed his approach somewhat, in as much that, you know, in the early days he was a lot more, you know, and he's kind of moved away from that now to other things, and I don't see that as a negative thing.
Yeah. Because
we all changed musically one way or the other, but he's certainly not doing the type of stuff that he did in the 80s.
So what sort of, I mean, of all the ones you're probably going to pick, this is probably going to be the most different techniques because he sort of did so many different things. So what sort of stuff did you get from him?
Well, just the whole principle of taking all that type of stuff, yeah, and also taking...
And that's what I mean by that pianistic approach, so he's got sort of a left hand and a right handle.
Yeah. Taking the tapping, and what it did was kind of make me realise, again, the whole tapping thing can be viewed as a total showboat, and it is very impressive to look at, but if you think of it as music, take a chord, just take a simple, and then you can replace in certain notes of the chord. became really musical, and it just made me think, this is somewhere I totally resonated with this, because it was something I thought, I can do that. I understand music, I understand chords, I understand the way it works, and it's just another aspect of one of the reasons why I chose to master the bass, because it's just so amazing. You could.
What about the slap stuff he was doing? I'll switch his snare. I've got a snare drum right next to you. What about the slap stuff he was doing? You mentioned that a bit earlier.
So the slap stuff for him, he moved away from the conventional, obviously, normal slap and top.
Yeah.
But he was adding in ghost notes, which a lot of players were doing anyway. But he was also using different colours with his playing. Like he'd take an open string. That notion of being able to again take a
very chordal approach, isn't it?
Yeah, very, very much so. I mean, those are not very good examples of these, because I've probably spent the last 30 years not trying to play like to play stuff off. It's difficult, but it was more the approach that I got from Stuart Ham. So, and again, fair play to him, he's still out there today doing it.
I think you've raised a very good point. On this channel, I think, and we haven't discussed it, and I might talk about it at some point later, but that Radio Free album is a very important jazz fusion album. It's not a metal album, it's a very important jazz fusion album in the 80s, and it doesn't get mentioned that much, and it's a killer. Also, did you ever hear the trio we had with Frank Gambale and, was it Steve Smith?
Yes, I did. Show Me What You Can Do.
I love that album. I think that's incredible. More recent, jazz fusion. Of course, on this channel, when we talk about recent jazz fusion albums, we're talking the last 30 years. So that's your number 5. So what have we got at number 4 then?
Number 4, I've got to say, would be Mark King.
I'm so glad Mark has mentioned Mark King. Because we're going to be able to chat about level 42 as well, which I haven't done at all.
Where do you start? Mark, if you're watching this, I love you. Always have done. I was born in 1972, so by the early 80s, mid 80s, I was right smack bang in the middle of all the wonderful music of the 80s happening. And then again, in amongst, you got so many great bands like The Police. And then also bands like Level 42, which started off with that complete, different approach to everybody else. Okay, it went a bit more commercial towards the last part of the 80s, but even then, you still got, by 1988, when they were doing some of the later albums, you got people like Gary Husband on drums. Yeah. So the musicians are just unbelievable. Alan Holdsworth on the album,
he is.
Again.
I hope Alan Holdsworth is going to be connected to every single bass player that you mention.
But what Mark is incredibly influential on me, and was one of the things that drew me towards the bass, just because of the presence of the bass within a song. Yeah. Because it was that level 42's got that real. That whole thing going through it, and to me that was just so amazing at the time. And I still listen to it now.
I agree, and I think you see, before I knew you, I had this jazz fusion band called Sinister Footwear, as you remember in the old days, and we were just obsessed with the first 2 Level 42 albums, which, if you listen to them, are very Stanley Clarke Return to Forever style albums. So they're a serious fusion band. And I think in British music, later on, all that acid jazz thing, like Jamiroquai, which is the biggest bands in the world, and the whole dance music thing, and the rare groove, and Giles Peterson, and all that stuff, actually has its roots in Level 42, because they really were part of that jazz funk thing. So there's that part of it as well. And then with Mark King, you've also got his vocals and playing the bass It's like, so we're talking about bass players, but who else on the list is going to be can do that? You know, he's just a one of a kind.
He is, yeah.
You know,
well, it very much falls into that category of how I try and view all serious musicians like yourself. To me, it's just a musician that happens to choose one or maybe two instruments as their voice. And someone like Mark, you know, whoever's heard him on drums, he's an amazing drummer as well. You know, he started off on drums, and you know, the story goes that he literally moved over from drums to bass in a matter of months, and was able to transpose all that, the kind of linear approach of everything he'd done on drums. And again, at the time, you'd got the kind of you know, Larry Graham, but he was able to take that and make it just sound like a...
It's like a drummer, it's like a drummer with drum fills,
So it was just a complete, it just sounded like a drummer on bass, and that was the one thing to this day, you know, I try not to sound like Mark, but take that approach of, you know, drums are a massive thing in my life. They've always been almost as important to me as bass, because, you know, I love listening to drummers, and I bring so much back from the drums to the bass. As you well know, I have a drum and bass duet called Funk Pete, which has been going for over 20 years, and that is bass and drums. Everything else comes on top of that.
If you send me the links, I'll put that on the video.
Sure.
I have to mention here that a few years ago I was in a band called Frost. I actually was a founder member of the band with Jem Godfrey, and originally had my mate John Jarrett on bass, but later on we were joined by Nathan King on bass. Now Nathan King is Mark's little brother, and he is the guitarist with Level 42. He's also a really incredible bass player. So Nathan, you are also an incredible bass player, but if you're watching this, go and tell your brother to have a look, because Mark, it will make his day. It's going to make his day if Mark watches this video. So you've got to make that happen. So so much love for Mark King, and I'm glad we've been able to mention him on the channel. So who have we got at number 3?
Number 3, reluctantly, in some ways, I'm going to say Jacko.
Oh, Jacko at number 3. Yeah. Jacko at number 3, shock.
And the influence Jacko had on me, again, like most people, is just unbelievable. You know, I first discovered Jacko in the late 80s when I think it was actually the year that he passed, because up until that point I was, you know, I came from a very similar background to you. You know, I grew up on the new wave of British heavy metal, Iron Maiden, Saxon Motorhead, Angel Witch, Quiet Riot, all those bands, and then, you know, as you progress and grow older, I started to listen to other things. At the time, I decided I wanted to. I've been playing for about 4 years, and I wanted to learn more about music theory and reading and stuff like that. And I found out a local teacher he was actually in the Red Lemons Blues Band, and he was also in a big band as well, a guy called Dave Green. And he was like, he's your chart man. You know, he got the real book, he got every chart. So I spent a few years studying with him actually, and because when I got with him, he was like, so have you checked out Jacko? And I'm like, well, who's that? You know, and of course within a short space of time, he turned me on to Jacko, Stanley, Clarke, Alphonso Johnson, people like that I'd never really checked out before. But the whole Jacko thing for me is, I think most bass players would say the same, is that it's just within me, it's part of me. He's so his approach at the time again was so unique, you know. I think his sound, I still listen to some of the stuff that he's done, the Weather Report, the Joni Mitchell. I listen to it to this day, and there's a slight irony with some of the people that you love, in that as a kid or someone that you really aspire to be like, you can't actually be like them, because, you know, my opinion is every musician's goal be to try and get their own voice. So ironically, you can't end up sounding like them, otherwise it'll just sound like a clone.
But so I think that's a big thing about the players that we like, when we go back to the players that we like, is they actually inspire you to try and be yourself. Whereas nowadays there's a big thing which is trying to push you to sound like something else, and you're watching everything going, oh my god, I don't know I can do that, and it's all quite depressing and intimidating. But I think when we came, it wasn't like that. You would take all these players in and you wouldn't think, I've got to play like Jacko.
But like, with Jacko, you can't, there's nothing else you can do with that. That's Jacko's, and you can't, whichever way you look at it, you can take a 60, I mean, something like Rocco Prestia, he was doing 16th notes, but it was completely different.
Yeah.
And also, what I've always admired about Jacko's playing is that it was always just slightly behind the beat or just slightly ahead. Just earlier today I was listening to a bit of Trio of Doom. Yeah. And the stuff he's doing with John McLaughlin, he's absolutely on it when they're playing their heads of the songs. But then when he's on his own, even his walking lines, they're really greasy and dirty, and And I don't. It's that thing that you can't learn that from a book. You can't necessarily pass that on to someone. You've got to. It's something that you've got to listen to continuously.
Yeah. So what you're saying really is that the thing with Jacko, with all that stuff there, the overwhelming thing you get from him is groove and feel, isn't it? It's his groove and feel. Yeah. What about the harmonics? Because I know you play a lot of harmonics.
I do play a lot of harmonics. Yeah,
is that from Jacko or?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, the whole. Obviously, his approach to music, really. The other part of Jacko I was going to say, and I've got to say, the fact that I put him at number 3 he should be at number 1, but there's not enough space to get everyone in. I view Jacko in 2 ways. I view Jacko as an amazing bass player who, technically he was excellent. Yeah. But there are people out there, even at the time, that have got more chops than him. It's his compositional skills.
This is, I mean, I don't know if Mark's seen this, but I've talked about this, coming to exactly the same conclusion. It irritates me a little bit that he's held up from a technical point of view. I was listening to Brand X this morning and listened to Percy Jones, 1976, and it's equally incredible, equally innovative. The Jacko sticks out, I think, because of his charisma, because of his groove and his sound, and most importantly, his compositions. I don't think there's ever been a bass player as great composition.
No,
they're like jazz standards. Portrait of Tracy is a jazz standard,
and just that you can take, stuff he used to do on his solo slots, and just using open strings. You take a song like.
The blues as well. It's the blues as well.
Amazing, and that it's not very difficult to play. But there's just so much music going on there, so I think it was about 1985. I don't know whether you've ever seen it on YouTube. He's had his hair really cropped short, and he's got Toots Thielemans playing on there. And there's an amazing jazz pianist whose name I can't remember now, but they're playing things like Dolphin Dance and stuff like that. But go check that out, because there's just so much amazing music. Equally as good as the Weather Report stuff. Yeah. And the word of mouth. But that, I mean, you'll remember this. In the 1980s, there was I can't remember what it was something either on BBC One or BBC Two. They put on a late night slot. It was about musical programs, and there was one on Mingus, a black and white one. Yeah. And then the other one was about Jacko, and the program. It was basically I think it was the Montreux Jazz Festival 1982. So you got Peter Erskine on drums. Don
Elias. Who else?
The Othello Molyneux. Yeah. So of course Randy
Brecker.
Yeah. So of course
I
it's
can't
on.
go any further. I want to Bob Minter on sax. Yeah. That's it. And he's got like the war paint on, hasn't he? He's doing all the walking. It's just classic Jacko, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think that was obviously around the time where he was starting to have his troubles and stuff like that. But even then, you know, there's parts of that. I used to have that on VHS, and I must have worn it out.
Same here.
Just watched it over and over. And Peter Erskine's playing.
Yeah,
I know, it's just unbelievable. And like when they play things like Donna Lee, I would watch this at a time before I'd really studied any type of jazz harmony. So I was like, what's going on? What is going on here? I don't get. How are they able to go off on all these tangents and journeys, then come back together? And it just hooked me. Yeah. Man, it was the start of a new chapter for me, watching all that type of stuff. Jacko, he's definitely one of my all-time heroes. I wish he was still here today.
Yeah, it's such a shame. So if we've got to number 3, the next 2 are going to just, I suppose it's personal to you, isn't it, the reason why they've... Because it's hard to think, you know, I mean, I've talked about Jacko positive and negatively on this channel, but if I was to say who was the greatest bass player, or say you had a book, greatest bass player, so you're going to put on the front, it would be Jacko. So who have you got at number 2?
So at number 2 is someone who has had so much influence on my playing. It's unbelievable. I think I'd watch him still to this day on YouTube. I'd love to meet him one day, hopefully. And I can remember when I first saw this guy, I just thought, oh man. It was where have I been going wrong all these years? Is
it Dave from Chaz and Dave?
Yeah.
A great bass player though.
Oh yeah. No, my number 2 bass player is Billy Sheehan. I first saw Billy in 1986, I think, when he was playing with Dave Lee Roth. And as we all did, we saw Yankee Rose, and you know, as kids at the time, man, you know, it was just the whole aesthetic, you know. You just saw this person that you want to be like.
I think you've really pulled. I think for my audience, with the prog and jazz fusion thing, you've pulled somebody really from left field. Billy Sheehan's coming, but it's the same thing for me. One of the greatest bass players that's ever lived, and a thing for me is that in 1986, and I've told this story before on this channel. I can remember, you know, sat next to my mate Matt Bourne at college, listening to my Keith Jarrett album and thinking I was sophisticated as a jazz guy, and then put all that rock behind me. And I said, "What you listening, Matt?" And he says, "Oh, a new Dave Lee Roth album." And I put it on, and he put Shy Boy on, and you know, him and Vi together. But you know, as much I knew Vi, you know, but Billy Sheehan, it was like, what is this? This is just another level of bass playing, isn't it?
Yeah, and if anything, it was his sound. He just, you know, bass. I've never been a fan too much of bass players that try not to make the bass sound like a bass. I mean, I as you can probably see, I've got a MIDI Roland thing, which I do play with sometimes. But for the most part, you know, I love my job as a bass, and I love the instrument because of just the tonalities, the dynamics, everything you can get out of the instrument. But Billy, you know, this guy took the concept of like Rickenbacker dual inputs into his bass. John Entwistle has been doing that. Yeah. But he's for whatever reason, for me, has seemed to have a much more refined tone to it, you know. And of course, so I listened to Dave Lee Roth, and then that spurred my interest to look back. Now at the time, it was actually quite difficult because obviously this was the days before internet and stuff like that. So the only way you could really check out new people, I was a subscriber to things like Bass Player magazine. I have an older brother who's a guitar player. He was a subscriber to Guitar Player magazine, so you get little snippets from there. Otherwise, it was jumping on the bus of for myself, because I grew up in Birmingham, and going into town and you know,
people don't realise this now. The amount of research you would have to do to find out a piece of information.
And on one such journey, I can remember going to the Virgin Megastore and finding an album by a band called Talus, and it was called Sink Your Teeth Into That.
Yeah.
And took that, put it on the record player, and again, it just blew my mind.
Well, I'm a bit older than you, so I can remember Talus. I can remember them being in Kerrang and just ignoring them because I didn't know that it sat in there was you know, Billy Sheehan, who was doing all that stuff in Talus, wasn't he? It's all on there, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think it's Shy Boy. Is that a Talus tune?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and then his famous solo piece MV43345 that was on there, and again, you got bearing in mind. It was probably recorded around 1984, something like that. The tone is just today, you know, it's still.
I'm really pleased you put him in there because I love jazz players. You know, I love the Jackos and all those players. But I have a very soft spot for rock bass players, which for me is like John Entwistle, Jack Bruce, and then it goes to Chris Squire, and then you get that Geddy Lee sound, Geezer Butler, John Wetton. I love that rock thick bass sound, and he's just the logic. You take all that and times it by 10 and put a rocket under it with a massive technique and bizarre stuff going on. You get Billy Sheehan. He's the peak of that. He's like the Jacko Pastorius of rock, really, isn't he?
He is,
you know, and he really. So, what about the tapping? So, what did you get from that? Because there's obviously, as well as Stuart Ham.
Yeah, I mean, with Billy, really, he's like on. That accordal approach of taking the. But also, what Billy takes is he adopts the tapping approach, taking a chord like just like, and he'll. Which again you can start thinking about doing triplets then. And then of course with the open hammer. And also
no one had ever heard that before.
But his whole...
Turn it down a little bit just in case we just... Take it down a little bit because it's... I've got so many snare drums in here, it's terrible to play bass. I think there's 5 snare drums.
So I don't have the dual output, but I do have a really nice big fat P bass pickup, which is, again, I grew up playing the P bass. That's my kind of thoroughbred, if you like. The jazz pickup came later, and I kind of cross over between the two, but nothing gives me greater pleasure than play, you know. So all my type of raking techniques and stuff like that, I nick from Billy. I don't mind saying that, but I've tried to make them my own. But no, he
and I can see why he's at number 2 because I can remember when I first met you and I saw you play and think, what the hell's this guy doing? It was really that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
You know, it was the speed that you were able to execute stuff. I've never seen anybody personally that could do that. So that's really Billy, isn't it?
It is, and again, it's funny because Billy, I couldn't play it like Billy because he plays obviously, he has a 3-fingered approach and uses all 3 fingers 4 sometimes. And it's again, I couldn't play like that. But what I have done is I was really inspired by his approach to the instrument, and have taken that away and tried again to mould it into my own playing. So it just, you know, just some of the albums, you know, in that period in the 80s, when I listened to one of my favourite ever guitar players is Tony McAlpine, and you know, it was actually my older brother bought Edge of Insanity, which of course got Billy Sheehan on. And man, just Steve Smith on drums, you know, what? It's just unbelievable. And just this complete sound on there, you know, I think on the very last song on the album, it's just a really, it's that simple, but the sound is just amazing, you know, and just it's that thing about Billy is that he's just got such an amazing fresh tone to his playing, and everything I've seen of him on YouTube, he seems like a super nice guy as well. I think his longevity in music, bearing in mind, you know, I know this is heavy on jazz and fusion, but you know, Billy's done an album with Terry Bozzio. You know, he did a project with Dennis Chambers for many years, Niacin. You know, so so he's really crossed over. And that's the thing. I mean, I think Billy would be the first to admit he's not a school musician. He doesn't understand theory. He can't read dots. You know, much like Chambers, and he's got, but you know, he's got that organic approach that he takes to the instrument. And fair play to him. You know, he's recently played with Simon Phillips as well. You know, so you can't. For someone who's a rocker.
He's a serious rocker. So we've got there now. So who have you got at number one? As your greatest bass player.
Okay, so this is incredibly difficult, but there is a reason for me choosing this. It's because, again, I think of this more as a whole musicianship thing, and I was very fortunate to see this person at a gig in Bristol about 5 years ago, and although I was a fan absolutely up until that point, it was only when I saw the gig I just came away thinking, I have only ever just scratched the surface of what you're about. And this gentleman is Stanley Clarke.
Without a doubt.
I don't know where to start with Stanley, really. Obviously, his career has spanned decades. He was there, you know, in the 70s when it was happening. He made his mark on bass. Like I said, I was introduced to him in the 80s by my tutor at the time. He can write film scores. He is an unbelievable upright player. In fact, when I went to see him at the gig, he didn't play electric bass for about an hour. He came on, and it was as good as Niles Osten Pennister. He was flying, absolutely flying, and I just couldn't believe it. You know, his chops are unbelievable. And the other thing is, if you come back to the electric side, his tone on the alembic, you know, and that area of just playing. All of that, and then he can go. In fact, that I think was the basically taps thing that he did in the 80s, you know, which is probably the only good album he did in the 80s. But he's got, for me, he's got it all, because he's maintained his career for many decades. He's got musical chops like you wouldn't believe. He did an outing with Victor Wooten and Marcus Miller, who are both
near misses. We'll have to get Mark. We'll get Mark back in to do the near misses, because I think we need to.
I think I could do a session on Victor and Marcus on their own. But that's no. To be fair, as I discussed this with Andy, this is about influences on myself when I grew up. Really,
these lists only can be that. That's why everyone checks them out. You know, if it was a. If it was a done deal and we had come up with the 5 bass players, you know, and if I did a list of 5 bass players, it'd be different guys, and I think Marcus Miller would be definitely in there for me.
Unbelievable.
Because I think he is my favourite slap bass player. There's something about his slap playing which is entirely different. But we're not talking about Marcus, we're talking about Stanley Clarke.
Yeah. So it's obviously Stanley Clarke, you know, Return to Forever. He's played with all of my heroes. I mean, Chick Corea.
Alan Holdsworth.
Yes, you know.
Alan Holdsworth.
That beautiful tune, Stories to Tell. You know, again. you know, and then obviously Holdsworth flying all over the shop over that, and all of that type of stuff that he did was just unbelievable. That he did the album with Stuart Copeland as well. You know? So he's really, he's kind of he's a bit like the Cliff Richard of bass players, isn't he? Because he just adapts to each new. I don't know who he's insulted there the most, Cliff or Stanley.
There's a couple of things I want to say. I had to do my top 10 favourite albums by Stanley Clarke for Sea of Tranquility, and when I did it I thought, well, I haven't listened to any of the new albums, but they won't be that good because they're up against these incredible albums from the 70s. And then I got into it, and the last 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 albums he's made are unbelievable. Some of the best fusion out there. So this guy, who is now in his 70s, is still just kicking it out of the park. He is just a phenomenal player. And I think you're right, you know, the thing for me with Stanley is there's a lot of bass players that are great, and when they come to solo, you're going, yeah, they're doing a bass solo, it's nice, but we'll have the guitar solo in a minute, you know, because they're up on the top of the neck and they've got a certain sound, and you think, well, it's okay, you know, it's a bass solo. But with Stanley can do bass solos because he has an exploratory thing where he sounds like he's going into new places, exactly like a saxophone player.
Exactly, yeah.
It's got those lines, and his lines are always so melodic, and I think his sound and the way he gets the notes out of there, he sings on the bass.
And I think that's another really important thing to say, because, you know, I only have to turn YouTube on. There's some amazing bass players coming up now. You know, the technique, because we're in this YouTube era, you know, you can take a kid, give him an instrument, sit him in a bedroom, and he can go to do the shed for a couple of years, and they'll get really good quick. But you can't. There is no substitution for learning your craft as a musician, learning about music, learning about harmony, theory, playing in a band, putting it all together. So again, when you look at people like Stanley Clarke, because he's got the pedigree as a composer, when he plays a solo, he knows when he's hitting a chord tone or whether he's hitting an accidental, an outside note. He's not just going for it. You know, I saw something just before Chick died in the lockdown, where they'd done an interview together, and I can't remember who was on acoustic, but he just played something, and it was just single notes, but you could hear the music because he was outlining all of the relevant.
There's bebop trained musicians. Exactly. He'd had that proper training. Because this is the shock. You know that when he emerges in the early 70s, this is one of the greatest double bass players that ever lived. And then he seems to quite quickly move to electric bass, which a lot of them do. You know, Ron Carter moved to electric bass in the late 60s, early 70s. But when Stanley moves to electric bass, he then rewrites the book completely.
Yeah, he does. He does. Unbelievable.
Yeah.
So definitely number one for me is an all-rounded musician and one hell of a bass player.
Yeah, I think we have got there. I think I agreed. I would put Stanley at the top of mine, I think. Yeah. And also the number of albums he's played on that are just my favourite albums. And his second solo album, the one with Bill Connors, Jan Hammer and Tony Williams, that's the great jazz fusion band that never quite was, you know, the most incredible. That seems to put everything together. Tony Williams' Lifetime, Babish Orchestra and Return to Forever all in one band, you know, so if you haven't heard that album, check it out. Anyway, I'd like to do a big thank you for Mark for coming in to do this. He's going to be back talking about all things bass on this channel. And if you like this, please like it. If you want to subscribe, please subscribe. If you want to support me more so we can do more stuff like this, then you know, join the Patreon, and I will see you on the next video. Thank you very much.